Hello everyone, my name's Emily Farquhar and I'm the Campus Cycling Officer at City of Glasgow College and Glasgow Kelvin College. Thank you so much for attending this session at Switching Gears Festival. I'm just going to take you through a bit about the festival and also some housekeeping. So if you're part of our returning audience, please feel free to switch off for a couple of minutes because you'll probably have heard this information 5 times already. So Switching Gears Festival is a collaboration between 9 universities and colleges across Scotland, and it aims to open conversations about how we can make cycling more inclusive and accessible for everyone in the future. With the help of some amazing individuals and organisations, tonight's session becomes the 5th one of 6 insightful sessions designed to introduce a whole range of projects and campaigns which support underrepresented groups to get on their bikes. I hope you learn something at this session and come away from it feeling inspired to use what you've learned to make the changes we need to see in the world. So before we begin, I'm going to take you through some housekeeping rules for the session. We will start with a presentation from our wonderful speakers and then follow this with a live Q&A session. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free to pop it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you're joining us on Zoom at any point throughout the presentation, and also please note you can submit Q&As anonymously. If you need any assistance with submitting questions or comments, or indeed with anything else to do with accessibility, please do message us directly in the chat box and we'll be happy to help you. It really does help if all the questions are in the same place, so please remember to submit them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. If you're joining us on Facebook, please submit your question in the comment section there. We'll be keeping an eye on both platforms, so we'll make sure your question gets answered. The entire webinar will be recorded, so if you miss something or you can't stay for the entire session, you will be able to find the webinar on the Switching Gears Festival YouTube channel later this evening. Also, if we run out of time and can't answer your question in the session, we will make sure to upload an answer for you in this recording. The session is scheduled to end around 8 PM UK time, but we might go over or under slightly, just depending on the number of questions we get. And finally, auto transcription is on, but you can turn this off if you wish using the live caption button at the bottom of your screen. So that's the boring stuff over. Now we can move on to hearing what we all came here for. I am delighted to welcome our 2 fantastic speakers this evening, Suzanne Forup and Sally Hinchcliffe. Suzanne is the Head of Development Scotland at Cycling UK and the co-founder of the Women's Cycle Forum Scotland. Sally is also a co-founder of the Women's Cycle Forum Scotland and is a writer and editor. She's founded or co-founded a number of cycling organisations, including the Cycling Embassy of Great Britain, Cycling Dumfries and Pedal on Parliament. And this evening, Suzanne and Sally are going to be talking about the Walk, Wheel, Cycle, Vote collaborative campaign, which asks all candidates for the Scottish Parliament to sign up to 3 key pledges to improve active travel infrastructure, accessibility and investment. I don't want to give away any spoilers, so I'll stop there and hand over to Suzanne and Sally. Suzanne and Sally, when you're ready, if you'd like to turn your camera on and your microphone as well, that would be great.
That's great. Thanks, Emily. I am going to attempt to share my screen and hope it comes up for you. There, how does that look?
Perfect, Suzanne, thank you.
That's great, wonderful. Well, it's fantastic to be here. Emily's already given a little bit of an introduction about us. So I suppose all I need to just reiterate is this isn't our day job. I work for Cycling UK. I manage all our projects and programmes across Scotland. Sally is an editor and a novelist, but has a tendency to set up cycling campaigns on a very regular basis. What we're really going to be talking about is quite a personal learning journey that we've been going through over the last couple of years with some collaborators from RNIB Scotland and Spinal Injury Scotland, which has really seen us change very much how we view the world and how we view our cycle campaigning. So this is the first iteration of this campaign. We started Walk, We Cycle, We Vote in 2015, ready for the Holyrood elections in 2016, and then we took it through to the local elections. I'm not really going to talk about this much. Sally's got a few more comments to make out of it. I'm really going to focus on the journey from this point. But suffice to say that Sally and I both came from the cycling part of We Walk, We Cycle, We Vote, and I suppose we're traditional cycle campaigners in that sense, but what we wanted to do was have a very different aspect of cycle campaigning, something that was much more inclusive, something that considered lots of different people's needs when they were cycling, and also had women at the front. So this particular picture was taken on the launch of our local election, and this was on Mother's Day to try and get it across the local press that women cycled as well. Really, everything changed from the route we were on as cycle campaigners. It was December 2018, and I was sitting in a cafe talking to Anne. This is a picture of Anne here with white stick, talking to my colleague Shona. We're in a cafe in Glasgow, talking about a tandem cycling project. Anne is blind. She's a very, very good and keen cyclist. And we were talking about getting funding to launch a tandem, an inclusive tandem project in Glasgow. And so after we'd finished our meeting and we'd finished our tea and cake, Anne said, Suzanne, can you just come outside for a minute? There's something I want to show you. And so Anne took me outside and showed me a lovely new cycle path, a new cycleway on Victoria Road. And she said, what do you think of that? And I said, well, it's absolutely fantastic, isn't it? I'll be able to cycle along here safely with my son. It's wonderful, all these things we're seeing in Glasgow. And she said, well, it's not great for me. I can't cross the road anymore. So what Anne showed me is a picture now of part of that cycleway. What you can see is the shops and the cafes and the restaurants on one side. There's a zebra crossing with tactiles on either edge of it, and I've pointed out in red just one of the issues, so the tactiles don't go back to the edge of the pavement area. So Anne said it's actually quite tricky to try and find a crossing like this, because you've actually got to know it's there in order to find it if you're walking along and using a stick to find your way around. Of course, that's if you don't collide with the cafe tables sitting outside on the pavement there. So she said this was the first problem. Also that there's no signalised crossing across the cycleway. So you are reliant on cyclists seeing you, slowing down and enabling you to cross. And of course, if you're blind, you often can't see the cyclist, and often because bikes are very quiet, you can't hear them. So I didn't take particularly good photos on the day, so I'm afraid this is a shot I've stolen off partner organisation's website. But these are the other things that Anne pointed out to me. Once you'd made that crossing over the cycle path, Anne wasn't sure where she was. What was it that she had crossed? Because she can't see that that's a cycle path and then the road. She explained to me that left her very confused about what she was going to be doing next, sort of adrift on this little island where the signalised crossing was. Unfortunately, she was at some stage able to enlist the help of someone who took her across the signalised crossing, where she would be able to safely stop the traffic and then go on to cross the road, and then of course have the same problem again, trying to safely cross the cycleway. So Anne explained all these things to me as we stood there, just looking at the street that 10 minutes before this cycleway had looked so wonderful to me. And really everything changed for me in those minutes, just trying to understand that something for me as a cyclist seemed absolutely fantastic, really didn't enable someone else to get around safely. What Anne wanted was not a staggered crossing like this, but a signalised crossing that goes straight across the cycleway and then across the road, so that she could stop the bikes and then stop the motorised vehicles to get across the road safely. And that really just didn't seem that it should be that difficult, really, and not really much to ask. So after this, I contacted RNIB Scotland and started talking to them about how they were feeling about new cycling interventions and the needs of blind people. So after that, the RNIB were incredibly positive and engaging. They invited me along to a series of fringe events they were running at the party political conferences that spring. So this is now the spring of 2019. We spent a series of weekends together. So there's 5 party conferences we went to. And this is one of the tweets that I sent out. So all part of the things that we were doing, as I was learning, was to make sure that other people were learning a bit as I went along. So I always made sure I sent out some tweets letting people know that I was at these events and these are the things we were talking about. So whilst we did these events, there was a lot of hanging around, there's a lot of chatting, there's a lot of drinking tea, drinking wine, hanging out, building relationships, sharing stories. And I found that that actually was one of the most useful things I did, because I got to talk to people, particularly Sandra. She's in one of the couple of the photos there. She's the shortest member of the party by about a foot. Sandra's blind, and she taught me an incredible amount about her life and trying to get around city centres when you can't see them. So after this, we felt that we really needed to follow these things up. So I told Sally about what I was learning from RNIB and my engagement with blind and visually impaired people. And so we decided that we really needed to explore this more, particularly around the issues that were coming up around cycling infrastructure, because that really seemed to be quite a big issue for blind and visually impaired people. And I didn't need to convince Sally that we needed to get involved in this. Sally could already see that there were some very difficult and unpleasant conversations going on Twitter between cycle campaigners and a number of disability groups, but particularly visually impaired groups. This really is never very helpful, having a conversation on Twitter where there's 2 very opposed forces. What we decided to do was run some events and bring cycle campaigners together with disability activists to actually spend some time together, to take that time out and to talk, to walk, wheel, cycle around some of our city streets. So we ran 3 events in this series, and we went to Glasgow, we went to Inverness, and we went to Edinburgh. And we brought cycle campaigners and disability activists together, and we actually chose the people so that we knew at least some of the activists would be prepared to listen to each other and try and understand with some empathy a bit more about each other's lives. So these were absolutely fascinating events. It's a process of constant learning, just being with people that use wheelchairs or a mobility aid. When you're not disabled yourself, all of this is completely new information if you've not experienced any of these things. It was incredibly revelatory for us. So after each of the events, we went back to an indoor space and sat together and talked and did a facilitated session where we talked about the things that we actually agreed on, because it was very evident the things that cyclists, cycling groups and disability campaigners disagreed about. And I'll come on to some of those later. But this process was all about looking at the things that we actually agreed on. Car dominance of our cities being an issue, and the need for everyone just to be able to get around safely from A to B under their own steam. I just wanted to point out this slide, this picture of Sally and I with one of our blind companions was used in the advertising for this festival. We chose that on purpose because it pointed out something startling to us. We obviously didn't take this photo, we were in it, someone sent it to us later on. And it shows us standing in the street in Glasgow on a piece of infrastructure that's been newly built and was causing great concerns to blind and visually impaired people. Sally and I are standing there pointing very emphatically at one of the curbs, which was making a lot of people unhappy. But what we're doing was pointing very emphatically to a man who is blind and couldn't see us. And looking at this photo back after the event, it really struck us that just because you know something, we knew the person we were talking to was blind, and yet we both stood there pointing something out to him. It really made us feel, again, how even if you know something, that doesn't really mean that you start acting on it. And we all have unconscious bias, unconscious actions, and it really brought home to us the sense of our own privilege in the way that use the streets, but also just go through the world as non-disabled people. So what did we learn? So we all agreed in these sessions that we did want less car-dominated streets. That was very clear, but access to a car and parking is needed for some disabled people. And when we talk about car-free, and cycle campaigners celebrate car-free areas, what that says to a lot of disabled people is that you are not able to get around anymore. You are going to be prevented from accessing this area. And so it's something cycle campaigners particularly need to be very careful about how we talk about cars, because whilst most people don't want them dominating our streets, they really are freedom machines for an awful lot of people. So we need to understand that point of view and to make sure that when we design our city centres and our towns, that disabled people are able to get where they need to go in their cars and to be able to park. So one of the major things we really learned about was the need for curbs. People that use long canes and have a guide dog need those curbs. That's how the training is done, and that is what makes them safe and able to cross the road with and to stop with any sort of sense of safety. Signalised crossings, incredibly important design feature for blind and visually impaired people. It's one of the questions I asked Anne back in the beginning was, well, how do blind people cross the road, particularly thinking about zebra crossings? And she said to me, well, I put my white cane out and I hope that no one runs me over. And that to me is not an appropriate way of designing our streets, people hoping that they will not be run over. So we really can't emphasise the need enough for safe crossings. Pavements was something really, I'd never really thought about pavements at all, to be honest, apart from perhaps when my son was very small and we used a buggy for a short period of time. But pavements are so incredibly important. The state of some of our pavements in cities is shocking if you're able to actually look at them. Making sure that they're clear of clutter, we need them to be well maintained. Many of them are covered in cars, and that's something that cycle campaigners are quick to point out. But bins, pavement cafes, they're all very problematic. If you use a wheelchair, a mobility aid, or you can't see them because you're blind or visually impaired, all of these become very, very difficult. Drop curbs, again, incredibly vital, particularly for wheelchair users. Again and again, we found people had stories where there were not drop curbs and they're effectively trapped on a pavement, not able to get where they're going, or finding that they end up getting tipped out of their chairs because they try to go across a curb that isn't actually designed to do that. So making sure that everyone's needs are looked at, and all the different ways that we need our curbs to be. It sounds very geeky, but we found it's absolutely vital for understanding the different way these things functioned. Shared space. Shared space means lots of different things to a number of different groups of people. Really, it's where you have a space that's used by one or more of pedestrians, cyclists and motorised vehicles. But even if motorised vehicles aren't in that space, if you have non-curbed spaces, so you have cyclists and pedestrians mixing, a lot of blind people, certainly all the blind people we met, found this very, very disturbing. It doesn't feel safe. They don't know who is coming by them. They don't know how to safely access and use that space. And so that is incredibly problematic, and the RNIB will always campaign against it. So as campaigners, this was, I think I've used the word revelatory, and it really was. What we've really learned from it as campaigners is the need to just stop talking and listen, to put down all your own views and agendas and actually listen with empathy to what other people are saying. I think so often in conversation, we're simply looking for the other person to pause so that you can get on and make your point. And what we felt we really needed to do is actually just to stop talking, and in the events that we ran was to not put your side across. And Sally and I certainly just tried to not talk about cycling, but simply to listen to other people's stories and experiences. Understanding our own privilege. I think cyclists are often feeling the least privileged in a road space. We are all crammed onto the areas left by motorised traffic, but we are not the most underprivileged, and we really need to understand that other people have needs which sometimes conflict with our own. One of the things that was very evident was the need to actually build relationships with people, not just understand their experiences, but to start to actually form relationships and friendships and spend time together so that you can actually build some trust. So when you do have difficult conversations, it's actually much easier to have them. And now what we started to do is this, and this is part of this evening and all of the work that we've done over the last year or so, is to speak up, to speak out and say, particularly to other cycle campaigners who are saying things which were really difficult for blind and visually impaired people to deal with, is to actually speak up on other people's behalves if they're not able to do that for themselves, not to speak instead of, not to speak over to people, but actually just call out. And we've been calling out cycle campaigners saying, well, I don't really think that that's going to work for everyone. We need to think about pedestrians, we need to think about disabled people when we're designing our streets, towns and cities. So I'm going to stop sharing and Sally's going to take over the next section.
Hi everyone, I'm just going to share my screen and pick up where Suzanne left off. And I want to talk about just going to start my the buttons have all just gone right over the slideshow screen. Right, so Suzanne's laid out the journey that we've taken. What I'm going to do is basically talk to you about how we've taken that new focus and how we're going to try and spend the next sort of 6 weeks building the political will to actually get politicians to do something about it, because we're actually asking for quite a big change. So we're going to focus on the election campaign that's coming up. We've already done one Holyrood and one local set of local elections as we walk, we cycle, we vote. And certainly the Holyrood elections, in conjunction with some campaigning with lots of other groups, and one of the really strong things about Walk, Cycle, Vote and Walk, Wheel, Cycle, Vote is that we are an umbrella organisation. We have support from over 50 organisations who've signed up to our asks, which means that politicians can't play us off against each other on things like budgets. So, and we feel that the concerted campaigning of all of these groups led to the doubling of the active travel budget in whenever it was, 2016, 2017. And another thing that we'd learned over the years was that politicians are actually humans, and they really like being thanked. And cycle campaigners certainly find that quite difficult. So, but we did basically thank, this is the Minister of Transport at the time, Hamza Yousaf, being given some cake. It's actually Rocky Road, which was our just little kickback. And he was so pleased about it. I think he mentioned it in Parliament about 3 or 4 times that he'd actually been given cake by the cycle campaigners. As I said, we have concentrated on unity, bringing people together and coming up with asks that everybody can agree with and sign up to, whether they're cycle organisations, walking, disability groups, health groups, play. There's a whole string of supporters on our site. I don't want to read these all out to you. I would say these are all on our website and you can read them along with a much more extended version, which kind of lays it all out in detail. But basically, after the journey that Suzanne and I had been on, after the lessons, we realized that we had to turn our asks around. We'd already emphasized investment as being our sort of first ask, because that was the one that's clearest. But we realized that we had to start with accessibility. And once you start with accessibility, and particularly for pedestrians and people using wheelchairs, then everything else kind of comes together. So we started with accessibility of places that everyone can use. And this is particularly for people on foot or in a wheelchair. And then we talked about infrastructure, which is the design of the streets and how we actually create that accessibility. And this is for walking, wheeling, and cycling. And we, rather than try and come up with a long list of things, we just set the goal that, which seems reasonable to everyone, that every child who wants to should be able to walk, wheel, or cycle to school, which is easy to say and difficult to do. And out of that comes the investment ask. There's long been a consensus that we need 10% of the transport budget to be spent on active travel. And we feel that that should really just be the starting point once you start to consider how unpicking 40 years of car-dominated investment, what a large task that is, that we sort of feel that actually we need to be looking beyond that to actually 20% once you start to include all the accessibility stuff as well. So as part of the campaign, we had sort of a number of prongs to it. One of it was just imagery. And far too often, certainly with cycling, you tend to see the same images of the sort of what I call the bum up cyclist, the lycra clad cyclist who's going fast. So one of the things we did, Suzanne did, was commission some imagery of cycling and walking. And this was for the first campaign. That we used just to illustrate stuff so that we were actually producing things that, you know, that looked attractive. And one of the things we did with those was we took some of the really good evidence for active travel. And I started calling these infographics, but they were rather disparagingly referred to as factoids. But still feel these are quite powerful, that we could take well evidenced but striking statistics, one per image, and combine it all into a very attractive package and share it. And that in our first campaign, we did that a lot on social media, and it got quite a lot of traction, got shared quite widely. And some of the stuff that comes out when you look at it is really impressive, you know, miracle. And these are sort of doctors and public health officials talking, not cyclists and active travel campaigners. So that's quite a useful way of sort of changing the story. As I've suggested, there's a ton of evidence. For this campaign, we've got someone who's just going through and sifting it all down and producing these great little briefings, 2 pages with a mass of footnotes, which just lay out for us all of the facts and evidence that you need if you're sort of taking it to a meeting or dealing with a politician or just trying to make a case for something that feels a little bit, you know, we've got it under things like inequality, we've got health, we've got accessibility. We're actually looking at joy, happiness as being one of the things, because sometimes you just feel like there needs to be more joy in life. And certainly in this election, we're going to need some joy, I think. But I think one of the things that's very clear, and anyone who's talked to or spent any time campaigning knows, is that evidence doesn't really change minds. It helps bolster people who've already made a decision. It gives them the ammunition they need. But what really changes minds is stories. And if you've ever listened to politicians, and this is especially the case at the local level, they will always tell you about what a constituent has said to them, or what their mother's done, or something like that. They think in stories. And so one of the things we're hoping to do in this election will be to get some of those stories out there. I'm not going to show this video, but if you don't follow Tricycle Mayor on Twitter, she's great. She's got a cute little dog. She makes little videos of herself in her trike, and she picks up both the joy and the freedom that the trike brings her as a disabled cyclist, but also the barriers that she faces, and that's much more powerful than anybody sort of quoting the guidance on 1.5 meters between barriers and so on. So what I'm doing is, this is an old version of our website. It's currently switched off because we haven't launched the campaign yet, but how we worked during the actual election campaign is we just basically tried to get anyone who was interested to contact their candidates, all of their candidates in the election, and tell them that they supported the 3 asks that we had for that election. and asked them to support them too. And then what we did was recorded the candidates' replies in our database, and you could see immediately whether your candidate had signed up to it or not and what they'd said on the subject. So you could search by postcode or clicking on a map, find who your candidates were, find out all their social media handles, and contact them if they hadn't responded, or if you felt that their reply was, or even just to say, that's great, thank you very much for supporting it. At the time, we were competing with what one candidate called to me as Bob the Sodding Squirrel. The RSPB had a very effective campaign, very popular, widespread campaign, which had automated click-throughs, which meant you could send a letter to your email to your candidates saying that you wanted them to support Bob the Squirrel for the RSPB. And I think that was a little bit, for certainly the feedback we had from politicians is that they felt that, you know, their mailboxes were stuffed with squirrels. So what we've tried to focus on is quality over quantity. So we don't have the massive metrics of X many politicians emailed, because we're actually, all we're doing is giving people the information that they need to write an email or send a tweet or send a Facebook message. So fewer people will do it, but the interactions will be better. And we hope that out of that will come people sending the sort of stories that change minds, rather than just, I had 50 emails about the squirrel. So bearing in mind, this was just really just me and Suzanne in our spare time, in our on our, you know, just in the evenings. It was pretty effective. This was for the local elections, which had an enormous number of candidates. And we found that 17% responded. Most of the ones who responded were supportive, because obviously the ones who weren't supportive just ignored us. And one of the things that was really, that we felt that we were getting traction was that even before the election, both the Green Party and some SNP branches actually signed up to our manifesto before the election. And certainly in Glasgow, they have come through with a 10% budget, transport budget spend. And that's, I think, has been behind the transformation that you've seen in Glasgow. Obviously not fast enough, but certainly when those spaces for peoples came in, Glasgow could hit the ground running, because they already had commitment to spend money on infrastructure. I think that's the sort of thing where we're moving the dial among the politicians who are perhaps prepared to support us, and giving them the courage to actually go through with it. We're still working on the 83% who don't respond, to try and give them more, start to change hearts and minds. That's really all. I just wanted to end with how you can get involved if we've inspired you. We've got a hustings event on the 30th of March, and we're really keen to get some different faces, different people joining these events, because I think the active travel political intersection is quite small. You do tend to see the same people at a lot of these events, so it'd be really great to hear some new people, get some new voices, especially young people. On our website as soon as the election is announced and the candidates are all confirmed, you'll be able to find your candidates, and we would urge you all to get in touch with them with your own stories and messages. You can follow us on Twitter, you can see our Facebook page, and if you've got anything you want to add, you can email us. That's actually Suzanne. You can email with anything you wish to say. So that's it from me. Let me stop sharing my screen. Right.
Great, thank you. Is that you all done, Suzanne and Sally? Great. Yep. Well, yep. Thank you very much for a really insightful and inspiring talk. We've had a great turnout tonight, and we already have some questions coming in. So just a reminder to everybody watching, if you would like to submit a question for Suzanne and Sally, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or on Facebook, use the live chat, please. And we'll try to answer as many as we can now. So yeah, first we have a few pre-submitted questions, and also a few questions from the Switching Gears team, if that's all right. So firstly, we have a pre-submitted question which relates to infrastructure in particular. So someone's asked, what are your thoughts on measures such as pop-up cycle lanes using wand orcas, etc.? A lot of councils are installing these from active travel funding to make temporary cycle lanes more affordable, but are they suitable for everyone?
I think we can both make some comment on that. I'm afraid it depends. Neither of us are engineers, and we don't have that expertise, no matter how many times we go out with our rulers and measure these things. So unless you're pointing at a specific scheme, it's difficult to know. Pop-ups are great because they are relatively cheap to install. It's a real life trial. Some people say it's a real life consultation, but they are by their nature put in very quickly, and sometimes they will probably not consider all the needs of all the people who might use that. So Sally and I caught up with our colleagues at RNIB Scotland and Spinal Injury Scotland probably every 2 to 3 weeks, pretty much the whole way through lockdown. And what they were saying was that lots of disabled people were shielding and so not going out, but many other people were not going out because they were frightened too, whether they were shielding or not. So I think it's probably difficult to tell at the moment which schemes are great and which aren't, because a lot of disabled people won't have been going out and finding them. What we do need to make sure is that consultation is done well, but not just consultation. There really needs to be much more of a bottom-up engagement process with people, and then to learn from it. I think RNIB constantly express the same things again. They've got very straightforward policy asks around curbs, shared space and signalised crossings. But some local authorities don't seem to be able to learn from each time they have an email from RNIB Scotland about they need to do the same thing. So I think that's a frustration from them. But yeah, I'm afraid we can't say either way, can we?
No, I think one of the things I can say, until you've actually stood on the street with somebody who's struggling to use a piece of infrastructure, it's really hard, especially as, a lot of our consultation formats aren't that accessible. And certainly a lot of the spaces for people stuff was not accessibly consulted on it. And while actually in a way you could say, well, actually putting it in the street, seeing how it works and then modifying it would be a really good way of consulting. That only works if the people who are disadvantaged by it feel empowered to go and actually can go out and say, look, this is what doesn't work. So potentially really powerful to put all this temporary infrastructure in place, let people use it, and then say, okay, that didn't work. How about if we do it like that? We could, that could actually be better for consulting with people than a PDF, which, if you're blind, how are you supposed to look at it? But if it's just like it's on the street and it's a fait accompli, then one of the things we learned from these events, wasn't it, Suzanne, is that a lot of blind people react to these things by just withdrawing from that space. And the first time somebody said, oh, well, this is a no-go area for me, and we're talking about the centre of Edinburgh, you think, oh gosh, that really is quite shocking that parts of our capital city are not accessible to someone who's perfectly capable of going about, but not the way the streets have been designed.
Great, thank you so much for giving such an in-depth answer. I think some of the comments that you've made there are really useful. I think particularly, that comment you made, Suzanne, about waiting and seeing what happens after lockdown starts to ease again, because we just haven't had enough time to see if these things are accessible yet. It's definitely something that we're going to have to do. So it's really useful to sort of hear you say that. Yes, so we've got a couple of other questions. This one's from the Switching Gears team. They've asked, when influencing the vote, how do you compete or tie in with other political issues that might be higher up the agenda for some people? For example, showing support for a pro-independence party.
I think one of the things we feel is that there's a lot of big issues in this campaign. There will be a lot of big, noisy, contentious issues. And one of the things we can actually do is offer a space for consensus. So there is no party that is standing on a platform, an open platform of let's just drive everywhere, it's easier. So every party we've talked to at least makes some positive response to the idea of active travel. They're not always completely clued up. They're not always completely committed to spending a lot of money on it. But it offers us, I think for a lot of politicians, it offers a place to actually set aside those really nasty divisive issues and say, okay, let's think about a better Scotland. So we absolutely do not want to take a position on anything like independence or anything like that. We cannot be seen to support any one. All we can do is say these are what the political parties have said, and against our asks, we can't say whether we endorse that or not, but we can offer people a chance to say, well, actually, look, here's something how we can make Scotland better. And that, I think, for a lot of people, it's a nice break in what's going to be a messy political landscape for the next 6 weeks.
Yeah, unless you have anything to add on that, Suzanne, I'll have a discussion with Sally about that. Okay, yeah, so I totally agree with you, Sally. I think that the Walk, Wheel, Cycle, Vote campaign really seems to sort of take a very positive approach to improving Scotland. So I totally see where you're coming from with that, and I think it does certainly provide a very welcome break for what is a very messy political landscape at the moment. So that's great. We have one other question that's been pre-submitted. So this question goes, after the first lockdown, I saw many new cyclists on the roads, but now that cars are back on the road, I worry many of these wobbly cyclists will have been put off getting back on their bikes due to increased traffic. Do you think there will be an increase in provision of connected safe cycle routes for the intrepid novice?
I think we're seeing that, aren't we? Scottish Government is investing more money. There was another 15 million chucked into the budget the other day because of the intervention of the Greens. So more money is going in, more infrastructure will be built, but it needs all of us to say that we want it. And it links to what Sally was saying about supporting our politicians to be brave. No one wants to stand on a platform that's immediately going to be ridiculed, taken away from them, and no one will vote for them. You know, politicians, they need to be given the support. And it also relates to saying thank you and having some gratitude. I think a lot of politicians feel got at. If you put in a substandard infrastructure scheme, all the cyclists will have a go at you and all the motorists will have a go at you if it takes away road space. So when schemes do go in, unless they're dire, we want people to say, well done, that's good. You could improve it like this, but well done for trying. That's great. So we're all part of this process. We have to support politicians to be brave, to make the decisions, to spend the money, to allocate the budget, build the infrastructure, so that we see more and different people able to cycle safely.
Yeah, and I think intrepid novices are the people we should be, that's why we find the imagery is important, that when people think about cyclists, that they're thinking about something beyond the mammal, the middle-aged man in lycra, that they're thinking about children, mums, dads with kids on bikes, and also people on trikes, and people from communities who don't have access to cars as well. So it's just remembering that it's not just your middle class professional out on his Sunday run that we're catering for. In fact, he'd rather ride on the roads anyway. So.
Yeah, I guess that what you've just said does really outline the value in creating sort of proper, safe, accessible, inclusive infrastructure that works for everybody. So that's great. And we just have one more question from the audience. So we've got Ella asking, how has COVID affected the Walk, Wheel, Cycle, Vote campaign?
We haven't been travelling around Scotland in the way we'd usually do. Most campaign years, I spend more time with Sally in a hotel room than I've ever spent with my husband. So much as I love spending every weekend in a hotel room with Sally, in some ways this has been much easier because we've had a lot of online contact, and that just gives us more and more productive time, I suppose. But it means we aren't making the same connections when we go somewhere and we have a hustings event or a networking event. We right up until the edge of lockdown, we were running lots and lots of regular events. It is very time consuming, but it has lots of benefits. So it is literally switching gears, isn't it? We've switched gears for this last year. I don't know how that will change over the next 6 months, because we're, hot on the heels of this election will be the local elections. So we've yet to agree that that's what we're going to do, but I feel it coming. Sally's smiling, so it's all going to be fine. But yeah, who knows how that will be. So there's been some positives, some negatives. Depends on how you view those things. Sally, have you missed all our dozens of weeks away from home?
Not really. But I think one of the things is I'm slightly worried that I'm based in Dumfries, and although Edinburgh and Glasgow have gone great guns with temporary infrastructure, we've got nothing. They've moved a bin and opened a park gate, as far as I can tell. So I'm a little bit worried that by the time I get to Edinburgh, it'll all have been and gone and then taken away again. So because I'm missing out on everything that's happening. I'm stuck in a little corner of Scotland, missing what's going on in the big cities. And I think it's also worth just to return to our original journey, is that while the first lockdown freed a lot of people to cycle, it was really interesting to talk to our colleagues in RNIB and Spinal Injury Scotland about how trapped their members felt. And when you think about, for a lot of blind people, their means of getting about often involves being guided by strangers and touched by strangers, which they can no longer do. And you can't social distance if you can't see where somebody is. So it is kind of sobering to realize that for a lot of people who feel that they've gone backwards, people who are able to get back independently are now trapped. And, we all know what trapped in our homes feels like now. But really trapped for people who are. Oh, someone's asked about Pedal on Parliament. Well, we had to cancel our plans for Pedal on Parliament last year, and this year we're doing what we're calling Light the Way. We're asking people to use projections and light and window displays to send a message individually, because we can't have people gathering the way we would in a mass Pedal on Parliament. So yeah, we're asking people to, if you go to the pedalonparliament.org website, I can't even remember what our URL is, you can find how you can show this. And we've got a very strong message on climate change this year with the UN conference. So watch this space for Pop on COP in November to Glasgow.
Great, thanks for that, Sally. It's really good to hear about Pedal on Parliament. It's a fantastic campaign, and if you are watching and are interested, definitely check it out, because you should take part. It's fantastic. I'll be there remotely. So that's great. I think that is actually all our questions for tonight. So I just want to wrap up and say a massive thank you to our wonderful speakers, Suzanne and Sally, for a really, really interesting talk.